It is so good to see you in the house of the Lord today. As many of you know, we just got back. So if I seem a little off today, it's okay. We spent, I don't know, I think it was 40 hours getting back. We started Thursday morning and got back Friday night. And so, I think it was 40 hours of travel from Thailand back here. We had a 16-hour layover in Korea, which actually was kind of fun. Got to go out and see Korea a little bit. But we were over in Thailand for, about 10 days or so, and that was a wonderful time. And as many as you know, I know many of you were praying for us. We did have a great time. Specifically at the retreat we did for the Nepali-speaking Burma refugees. I always have to think about that. Sitting down with them and hearing their stories, I'm always so humbled. Talking with so many people who, the pastors of the church, in 1996, they left Burma during terrible time, and they show up to Thailand with nothing, no papers, nothing, no money, everything. And then very quickly, the husband is feeling called that there's no Nepali speaking refugee church in all of Thailand. Theirs is the first Nepali speaking, all these refugees coming over from Burma. They were the first church, and he just felt like as he's trying to support his family that the Lord was calling him to start a church. And so he starts going to this little Bible college and starts a church, and they have nothing. This sacrifice, and then talking with people how long? Oh, I came over 7 years ago. Hearing their story, their commitment, their sacrifice. They all speak 4 and 5 languages. And I'm just always I'm thinking, you guys should be preaching to me. It's always tough. Just humbled. And they just love the Lord, and God is working, and but it's a tough situation, and so keep them in your prayers as people are still showing up regularly from Burma, just seeking anything of a better life. And so, that was our time over there. It was good. But this morning, happy Easter. Christ is risen. Happy Easter. He's risen indeed. And I love discussing the meaning of Easter. And we do that a lot. I feel like I do that a lot. I'm a big believer in the central message of the cross. And I believe the cross should permeate everything we talk about. And discussing the meaning of Easter is something we should do regularly. How the resurrection has changed everything. And it's not something we just celebrate on Easter Sunday. It's not just something we do today, but it's really a message and a story that we celebrate every day of our lives. But this morning, I wanted to maybe do something a little different and talk about the actual, not the meaning of the resurrection, but that Sunday, some 2,000 years ago, that actual day, the historical reality of it. The actual resurrection. Why should we believe it? Do we have good reasons for believing in the resurrection? Should an intelligent person who likes to consider all of the angles and all of the information, should they ever arrive at the conclusion that God, the creator of the universe, became a human and died on a cross? My whole life, I have had this inescapable curiosity. My dad will tell you that when I was 4 or 5, and this is back in the late 80s, back when video camera, think of, for those that were alive in the 80s and 90s, a video camera. Think of how big it was and what it would look like and everything, and how much it would cost. And my dad gets up and leaves the room, and when he comes back in, his little, I don't remember my age, but I had taken apart his camera. And I was known for that. I was known for taking apart things. And I've always had this inescapable curiosity to want to know how things work, to get into the very core, I've never been one just like off face value, just tell me something. Questions for me always lead to more questions. It's been my experience, it's my inescapable curiosity, and I'll share a little bit of my own journey around this with you. When I was 20, I had a very powerful experience with the Lord. It's when my life was really radically changed. I grew up in a Christian family. I grew up going to church. But in my 20s, I guess we can call it where you make faith your own. And I think everybody has to go through that process, especially those that grow up in the church. That's the big challenge for those that grow up in the church, is they're kind of it's just always around them. It just kind of, the talk is there. They go to church. They know, they've heard the name of Jesus so much, and they look at the behaviors and the models and the patterns, and they just kind of follow suit. And that big challenge is that time when they make it theirs. And I didn't make it mine growing up in the church. I went and did my own thing and came back when I was 20. And that's when the Christian faith became my faith. And there was a wonderful period of time as well. My life did begin to change. But as time went on, and again, my inescapable, curious nature, I started thinking about things and bumping up. I was in the military, and so I was involved with a lot of different people and a lot of different faiths. The military tries to be, accommodating, right? It will have services for all different religions and things. And thinking about my moment, this experience I had that really began to change my life, I started seeing other people and hearing other stories also about how they had these wonderful experiences with God and their lives were changed, but they were Muslim or Buddhist. And the reason that I would give on why, I was a Christian, they were giving the exact same, the frame of the argument was exactly the same. But their conclusion was a different religion, right? I would say, oh, well, I had this experience and my life began to change. They're like, me too. I was like, okay. Lives were changed. They were better people. So again, my nature, what is true? And I would come across Christians, and I would ask them at that time too, how do you know it's true though? At that time, a big answer I would get would kind of, I'll boil it down to some cliches, right? Or one major one. I would get this kind of God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And listen, that's good for a lot of people. And I'm not even making light of that, but back to my nature and my personality, I struggled with that. The idea of circular reasoning. I believe it's true, therefore it's true. Or it's true because I believe it's true. I struggled with that. They had confidence and they had a degree of certainty, and it felt like the confidence in the certainty rested upon the simple fact of their certainty. Or they would bring it back to their personal experience. In personal experiences, like I said, that was my story at the time, my personal experience. I really felt like God encountered me. But how could I know? And especially as other people are saying very similar things. I realized that, a sense of psychological certainty based off personal experience, it's good for the person with the personal experience. But it wasn't ultimately satisfying for me as a convincing claim. Like, is all there was personal experience? Is that all we had to offer? Many people feel certain about a lot of things, right? And people who feel certain about a lot of things disagree about how certain they are about things. And think about, as I'm thinking through all this in my very early years, and as I'm really made my faith my own, but I'm just beginning to struggle with thoughts and ideas. Think about the certainty. If we're going by like certainty, like convincing yourself it's true, I thought about the certainty a person must feel to strap a bomb on them and walk into a mall and blow themselves up along with 30 or 40 other people. That's got to be some pretty strong certainty to do that. But their very strong certainty, does it convince you that they're right? Do you have that level of certainty? And so certainty, someone just feeling really strong about it, didn't do it for me either. And see, my brain has never let me off the hook with these types of issues. And I've always deeply sympathized with question askers. You'll find me, like people that have questions, that struggle with their faiths and want to say the thing that they're really thinking. Because a lot of times what I've discovered being in ministry for a while now is a lot of people do kind of have thoughts, questions, doubts, concerns, but they're so Christian they know not to ask it in front of other Christians because that's not the Christian thing to do. But I sympathize with the question askers. I was a question asker. I upset the apple cart very early on, well, how do you know it's true? And it's like, that offended some Christians. Well, how do you know it's true? Well, God said, you're saying God said it, but how do we know that God said it? Boy, don't you quit. I'm like, look, I'm being on. I'm not trying to disprove anything. I'm passionately in this. I just want to know. And at the time, I was basically given two choices, right? I am told to abandon the rational, critical inquiry, like abandon the mind, or in a sense, abandon the faith. Your mind is your enemy. See, asking all of these questions, trying to think about this stuff is dangerous. You just got to believe. And I was posed with those two things. But I realized that ultimately that if Christianity was really, really, really true, it would have to hold up to a reasonable degree of critical inquiry. It would have to. There's no way that it can just check your mind out and you just have to as though you pull out your notebook and just write with a piece of paper, I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe. And if you write it enough, all of a sudden it becomes real. It had to be able to withstand a reasonable amount of critical inquiry. Why do we celebrate this day, Easter Sunday, a resurrection? A historical event or not? Quickly, myself, and if you began to inquire along these lines, you'll start bumping up against arguments on why you shouldn't believe in the resurrection. And I want to give you 4 of probably the most popular arguments in the academic world on why you shouldn't believe in the resurrection? And I'll offer my response, because this is a little journey that I went on myself. Again, that if it was really, really true, there is a reasonable degree of inquiry. And our Christian faith is not a philosophy. It's not wise sayings. The Christian faith is rooted in a historical event or not. The Apostle Paul says, either Christ was risen physically, or we are fools. A historical event or not. But probably again, I'll go over the 4 most popular arguments why you shouldn't believe it. And I'll go in descending order. Number 4. Many would tell you that the resurrection is just a legend. Just developed as legends do. Legends are everywhere in human history. A lot of the movies you watch are recreations of legends that have been told for thousands of years. There's legends all throughout history. And the people of the Christian religion, the people of that legend, just kind of like conquered and won out, and so that legend has risen more to the top. It's just a legend. Legends have similarities. Christianity just has similarities among all these other legends. There are other virgin birth stories, right? Plato has one. Alexander the Great has a virgin birth story. The Buddha has one. There's people rising from the dead. The 2nd century magical worker Apollonius is considered to rise from the dead. You dismiss all these other legends as just fairy tales. Why don't you just dismiss the Jesus one as well? And see, those things kind of sound like they have some punch on them right at the start. But with just a little bit of detailed analysis, you discover that these similarities and the story around it, they're very superficial. Take Apollonius. Nobody wrote about him. Our earliest writing is 150 years after his life, and his rising from the dead account is a story a lady claimed that he came to her in a dream. That's not really the same as the Jesus claim that happens within 30 years, and Jesus is hanging around people, teaching with them, eating with them. The idea that somebody wrote a story 150 years later about how a woman claimed she saw him in a dream it's not even on the same ballpark with the claim that is made around Jesus. All of the virgin birth stories that came out, guess what? They come about after the successful spreading of Christianity. It comes after Christianity has already kind of been successful and spreaded. Then all of these stories get reinterpreted. And, well, Jesus became this amazing figure from this virgin birth. And so they started getting attached on much later date. And legends almost exclusively take a very long time to develop. They change and they grow over a long period of time. The Buddha stories come 250 to 500 years later after his life. These legends don't just start up. They have a long development period. And with Jesus, you don't have that. You have people writing about Jesus within 2 decades. People are still alive when people are writing about it and dropping names. So you have this case where very early, attached into the same generation, people are writing the story down. Names are given. Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, Joseph of Arimathea, James, the brother of Jesus. These people are still alive as these things are being written about. How do you explain, right, the mother and brother of Jesus believing that Jesus is God? The legend hypothesis just simply doesn't hold up. There's not enough time. This theory that some skeptics would like to pose as some strong claim against the resurrection falls very quickly from any scrutiny. you also have the wrong culture for a legend like this to develop. Christianity begins and spreads amongst first century Judaism. This was not a culture that was sympathetic to legends or stories. That's what the pagans did. The pagans told all the stories. Jewish believers were very resistant to the idea of God becoming a person and being worshipped. Legends meet the needs of the culture and the society. It reinforces values and beliefs. But the story of Jesus found in the gospel fits nothing of the presuppositions that first century Jews would have been looking for. They were monotheistic. They were not about to worship a human being. They were not believing God was going to become a person. They were looking for their war hero like David. They were not expecting their Messiah to be crucified and embarrassed. Legends reveal heroes. And the Gospels, apart from Jesus, just reveal how the disciples are a bunch of bumbling idiots. This was a major reason why C.S. Lewis becomes a Christian. He is a trained mythicist. He has studied the ancient legends and myths. That was his hobby. That was his profession. That's what he's taught. And when he began to look at the Gospels, he recognized very quickly the Gospels are not legend and myth. And it was coming from someone that studied legend and myth his whole entire life. The legend hypothesis doesn't hold up. Number 3, right? The next reason why skeptics would say you shouldn't believe in the resurrection is they say the disciples just made up the story. This is known as the hoax theory. They just made it up. The disciples just lied. People lie all the time. People make up stories all the time. And that's what answers this. But if they would lie and make it up, what would the motive be? For me, this is one of the most convincing proofs of early Christianity. Ask yourselves, why do people lie and why do people scam? Why do they do it? They do it for a benefit. They do it for personal benefit. You lie and you scam to get something, whether it's money, whether it's fame. What would the early Christians, the early disciples, what was their motive? What good came from what they were saying? 10 of the 12 disciples were martyred for what they were proclaiming. There is no testimony, no writing where any of the early Christians, especially the disciples, recanted what they said. And listen, when a lie or a hoax begins to be unprofitable, it usually falls apart very quickly. Look at our modern day story of Watergate. You have 10, 12 of the most powerful people, educated people. And there's a scandal, there's a hoax, and they're trying to figure things out. And within months, these powerful, educated people could not hold together their story and all begin to recant and confess. And the whole thing falls apart, as many of you know. They couldn't hold on to their hoax for months. With all of the opposition in early Christianity, and there was a lot, there is no record of any of the disciples recanting. And with all of the opponents and with all of the persecution, there's no writings that ever made the claim that the disciples made up, that they just lied about what they were talking about. That theory just doesn't hold any weight. Number 2, skeptics will say that there's no evidence outside of the Bible that corroborates the story. This is an interesting one, because there's a part of this, they're looking for like official documents from like the Roman Empire about all of this. But the ancient world isn't like the modern world. Number one, there weren't TVs, right? There weren't phones. There weren't tabloids. There wasn't social media. And all of the writing being done was done by those hired by the emperor or the court. People didn't just write about things. There wasn't journalism. And with that, most estimate we only have 1 to, at best, 5% of the ancient writings that existed around that day. Egyptologists, people that study Egyptian history and archaeology and everything, they say think of everything you've ever read about Egypt and all of the information, they say we've only discovered 1% of Egyptian history. Think about how much, so number one, think about how much of the writing we just simply don't have. But the reality is that even with that, there is a lot of references to Jesus. Most historical events that you go to school and learn about rely upon one witness. The Persian Wars, written 70 years after the event, we have one person writing about it 70 years later, Herodotus. And that's all we have for the historicity of that. First century Judaism, we mainly just have from Josephus. Alexander the Great, we have basically one author that wrote 400 years later after Alexander the Great. The early Middle Ages, we really just get from 200 years after that time from the Venerable Bede. And this is the standard for historical writing. The standard is one source many hundreds of years later. This is very, very common, but not for the Gospels. Skeptics set the bar unreachable. Because the reality is we don't just have one source 400 years later talking about Jesus. We have 4 within 30 to 40 years when people were still alive, when people could go find Joseph of Arimathea and say, hey, this guy's writing about you, and he said that you put Jesus in your tomb. But we also have the Apostle Paul, who's writing maybe 20 years after the life of Jesus. We have the author of Hebrews. We have Peter, we have Jude, and within 100 years, you have dozens more. The reality is, why isn't all these writings corroborate Jesus? Actually, we have so many that it's almost embarrassing. We have non-Christians. Josephus, who never became a Christian, references Jesus. Thallus, writing in the time of Jesus, doesn't name Jesus, but he writes during the early first century about this prolonged period of an eclipse when out of the blue the sun was darkened for hours, specifically in the Judean region. What is Thallus talking about? Tacitus talks about Jesus and the persecutions and the crucifixion. Suetonius mentions the disturbances throughout the kingdom that point back to Jesus. And Pliny talks about people. These are all people in the first century talking about Jesus. The fact of the matter is we have close to 30 sources in the first century that point back to the person of Jesus. And do you know what the number one reason why academics say you shouldn't believe in the resurrection? Which I find very interesting because I think it's one of the weakest arguments. Is they just flat out say that miracles are not real and cannot happen. And that's their number one argument. People were just more gullible back then. Because people in the first century didn't know that dead people stay dead. This is how we treat historical, people. They were just so dumb that they didn't understand that when somebody died, they didn't just get up a couple days later. They try to point to science. But science doesn't prove miracles can't happen. G.K. Chesterton, or I get it confused, it's either him or Lewis, but he gives the story of, if I put $100 in my drawer in my hotel room and I leave and I come back later that day and the $100 is gone, do I say that the laws of science have been broken or the laws of Great Britain? My professor at Asbury, Craig Keener, set out for over a decade and researched miracles and has put together an 1,100-page, 2-volume set on miracles. His struggle as a world-class academic is that in his profession, skeptics just reject miracles not because they've actually looked into any of it, just because they just begin with miracles don't happen, therefore miracles can't happen. And he claimed this circular reasoning is all throughout the academic environment. And so he went around for a decade collecting hundreds of pages of documented miracle reports. Many from trained medical professionals, missionaries, and eyewitnesses across the globe, and put together an 1,100-page book. He reports healings, exorcisms, visions that are widespread and consistent around the modern day. He's not talking about something like looking if something happened 500 years ago. Right now, around the globe, all of these cases. And what he came to the conclusion is most of the world's population believes in miracles. If you travel anywhere outside of the enlightened Western world, they believe in supernatural and miraculous events. And he says that this is an extreme Western bias that just automatically dismisses miracles. He tells this wonderful story about this woman that's got medical x-rays and everything. And his point at the end kind of can come to this, is if one miracle is credible, then the resurrection becomes a legitimate historical question, not just a religious one. And as I began many years ago, realizing that I wasn't left with two options. It wasn't just believe because everybody else around me believes or because I'm told to believe, but that the Christian faith is true because it's true on many fronts. I became confident that this was not just a religious or personal experience event that has happened, but that there is a credibility and a reasonableness to the resurrection of Jesus, which is the foundation of our faith. Now, very shortly, we just went on a bit of a journey through a lot of questions and objections. And it's okay if your head's spinning a little. It's okay even if you're maybe a little confused. But ultimately, the Easter truth is the resurrection of Jesus is a historical reality. But it's more than that. It is personally transformational. See, the evidence is very strong. But I say this, Jesus didn't rise to prove a point. He rose to meet you where you're at. His first words when he appears to his disciples are, "Peace be with you." The way I like to think of this is the first words from heaven on that day that changed everything was peace. Peace be with you. Today, let Easter land on you like this. If you are like me, and maybe you're not. Thank God if you're not. If you're like me and your brain needs some reasons, the resurrection holds up. If your heart needs healing, I'll tell you this, Christ still shows up and comes close, just like he did with Thomas. And if your soul is tired, he still says, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." Jesus is risen, and that changes everything. And we don't just say he's risen because it's the Easter Day slogan. It's the truest thing about reality. The tomb is empty. Jesus is alive. And that means that your past doesn't get the last word. That in the present, you are never abandoned. And your future is not a question mark. It's filled with the same resurrection hope that Jesus always offers. And I tell you this morning, whether you are full of faith or whether you are full of questions, or maybe you're just somewhere in between, the risen Jesus still comes and still invites. And he might be just inviting you today. Let the resurrection be more than just a reasoned conclusion based off a historical survey. Let it become your living hope. Happy Resurrection Sunday. He is risen. Lord Jesus, we thank you. We thank you. And Lord, I pray that no brain get in the way of you personally coming to encounter people. And as you came to Thomas who needed more, I pray that those that are here that have questions or struggle, I pray that you show up to them, that you meet them in their need, that you become the living hope. Amen.